Why did I have my headphones on? I wasn't even fucking listening to anything. Obviously. Okay. During the next hour, he hit snooze several more times. In between, he slept. But it was a twilight sleep, semi-conscious and mindful for a few minutes at a time, until his thoughts would lose coherence and stray into blurry wisps that were to dream that were to real dreams as cobwebs are to spiderwebs. He wondered whether designers of the phone had performed clinical studies on snoozers in order to decide on the 9-minute interval. Why not 8 minutes? Or 10? The makers of the phone were famously particular about design. This had to have been data-driven. It was no coincidence that Dodge was being afforded just enough time to lose the thread of consciousness before the alarm went off again. If the interval had been much shorter, he would not have had time to drift off so much, and so this feature could not have truly been called a snooze alarm. Much longer, and the snooze would have deepened into true sleep. He was able to maintain a rough count. I have hit the snooze button 3 times. 5 times. Enough times that I have overslept by about an hour. But no sense of guilt or urgency attended these makeshift calculations. He knew it didn't really matter, because during the interval of consciousness that had followed the 3rd tap of the snooze button, he remembered that he was not expected in the office today, for he was scheduled to undergo a routine outpatient medical procedure at 11 in the morning, which was still hours away. Don't mind me, just... These things are an addiction at this point. Other than the desire for coffee, the only thing that was making him feel any pressure to get out of bed was, curiously, a mild awareness that all of this extra sleeping was going to make it harder for him to have his afternoon nap. This happened every day at 2 or 2:30. He had been doing it religiously for about a decade. When he had taken up the practice, he had wondered if it was age-related, since the Ulsters in his family were known for nodding off in church pews, on porch swings, or even behind the wheel. But he could remember being 18 years old, driving all over the western United States and Canada in various beat-up vehicles, and being overtaken every afternoon by a need to sleep so intense it was almost painful. He'd always tried to fight it off, or else simply avoided driving at that time of day. The only things that had really changed since then were that he was richer, so he could have a private office with a yoga mat and a pillow in the corner, and he was wiser, so he knew better than to fight the mid-afternoon lull. By closing the door, silencing his electronics, unrolling the mat, lying down, and letting sleep take him for 20 minutes, he was able to refresh himself to a degree that would then keep him working alertly for several hours more. Ugh, my mouth feels very dry. The amount of time spent asleep didn't really matter. He had decided that the key to it all, the one thing that determined whether the nap would actually refresh him, was the breaking of the thread of consciousness, that moment when he ceased to think in a coherent, sequential, self-aware way and went adrift. Reading all of this is making me kind of jealous of that at the moment. Probably like, oh my god, shut up and read the story. And then I'd say, screw you, I make videos however I want. That's the last pretzel, I swear. I gotta get another glass after I stop recording. Oh my god, where was I? Oh yeah. Often, this was connected with a jolt of an arm or a leg as he stepped over the threshold from the conscious thinking into a dream where he was obliged to reach out and catch a ball or open a door or something. If the jolt didn't wake him up, then it meant he had snipped the thread of consciousness and that the nap had thereby achieved its only real purpose. Even if he woke up 10 seconds later, he would be as refreshed, possibly more so, as if he'd slumbered deeply for an hour. He had studied the jolt. On those increasingly rare occasions when he slept with a woman, he would sometimes will himself to stay awake as she fell into slumber, listening to her breathing and feeling her body go soft against his, until, just as the moment when she drifted away, she would convulsively move a limb. His business activities, he was the founder and chairman of a large video game company, sometimes involved flying in a private jet to the Isle of Man, 8 time zones away, where a longtime business associate, an independently wealthy writer, dwelled in a renovated castle. The writer would put him up in a bedchamber in one of the towers, a round room decorated with medieval bric-a-brac and warmed by burning wood in a fireplace built into the wall. The bed was a 4-poster with a heavy canopy. A couple of years ago, after climbing into that bed and lying there sleepless for a while, Richard, for that was Dodge's real name, had finally drifted off and fallen into a nightmare involving a very dangerous and unpleasant character he had tangled with some years earlier. He had awakened to the hallucinatory awareness that this man was standing next to his bed looking down at him. I recognized this immediately. This is sleep paralysis. When I first read this, I have that, seeing things, being paralyzed. You laying in bed, but you can't move. And then like outer body experiences. It's just something that happens. Which was impossible. No, it's not. I need to shut up. Okay. Which was impossible since the man was dead, but Richard had been in a half-dreaming state where logic did not hold sway, and all he knew was what he saw. He tried to sit up. Nothing happened. He tried to raise his arms. They did not move even the tiniest amount. He tried to draw breath and scream, but his body did not respond to the command from his brain. He was perfectly helpless, lacking even a bound captive's power to struggle against his bonds. all he could do was experience the terror of it and the horror of his complete lack of agency until somehow he drowsed off again. Yes, all of that is entirely relatable. Next paragraph. Moments later, he had awoken with a start and sat up convulsively. His body worked again. He threw off the heavy duvet and swung his feet off the bed, turning to face the dying fire a few feet away. No one else was in the chamber. The massive fortress-style door was still bolted. The nightmare impression, which had been so convincing a minute ago, now seemed ridiculous. Lying back down experimentally, he looked up and saw that the lamp on his bedside table was casting a firelight shadow onto the canopy above him, and that the shadow moved about as the fire flickered and the log settled. He must have half opened his eyes while sleeping and interpreted this as the shadow of a man. Quite literally, a shadow of a man. So the nightmare had an explanation. Still mysterious, though, was the absolute paralysis that had trapped him in that bad dream. Later, Richard had learned that this was a well-recognized and scientifically verified phenomenon known as sleep paralysis. Primitive cultures identified it as some form of enchantment or made up stories about eldritch night-stalking creatures that would sit on your chest and pin you to your bed and suck the air from your lungs and the screams from your throat. But there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for it. When you were awake, your brain could of course control your body. When you slept, however, you tended to dream. And in your dreams, you could run, fight, and talk. But if the body continued to answer commands from the brain, you'd be thrashing all over the bed, vocalizing, and so on. So a mechanism had evolved, whereby in the moment that the thread of consciousness was severed, the link between brain and body was cut, like throwing a switch. At the moment you woke up, the switch was thrown back to the on position, and you were back to moving around as you always did. Normally the symptom worked with an amazing degree of perfection. System, not symptom. So most people lived their whole lives not even knowing that it existed. But every system had glitches. The jolt you sometimes made while drifting off to sleep was one such. It happened when the switch was a fraction of a second late going off. Another, much more impressive and terrifying sort of glitch happened every so often, especially to people who, as in Richard's case on the Isle of Man, were sleeping off of their accustomed schedule. You would wake up, but the switch would not be thrown on, and so you would remain as perfectly paralyzed as you had been a moment ago while sound asleep. Just like a person who, while seeming to slumber and breathe peacefully, is in fact having a terrible nightmare, you would lie there with your eyes open in perfect, inescapable repose, unable to do anything about the imaginary monster on your chest, the intruder next to your bed, the fire consuming your house. I hope you enjoyed this reading, and I hope to see you soon. Good night. I love you.